Hello, welcome to the podcast. My name is Rhiannon Berry, and I am the host of a living library of resiliency, creative conversations. This is episode 6. My special guest co-host for this episode is Adele Campbell. She is a micro butterfly artist out of London, Ontario. And our guest today is drummer, music engineer, and podcaster Ted Marotta. Ted Marotta is the drummer in Dr. Lowe et Le Band since June 18th, and they have already been actively touring. Also a music engineer, a podcaster, and a father, he is a New York native and a traveling musician at heart. He began his passion project, a podcast titled A Little Bit Famous, in June 2021, and he has had some incredible guests, including Grammy Award winners. Ted began drum lessons at 8 years old and developed his creative career dreams then. Still, the combination of a fascination with history and some social career conditioning had him choosing college instead. He continued to play in a garage band, though, exercising his creative muscles. In time, he left college and embraced band life full-time. His 5-piece band, Ominous Sea Pods, toured nationally for a decade, and in their heyday, they were playing upwards of 300 shows a year and had developed a die-hard following. With the band members reaching their early 30s, the band dissembled, and Ted returned to his love of learning about history. After he achieved his goal of becoming a historian with a PhD in American history, Ted became a professor. Over the years, he found that students were not giving the same engagement and energy that had once fed his appetite for teaching. And coinciding, his marriage was faltering. The marriage ended, and the grief of not being around his children all the time set in. He began drinking and also fell in love with a coworker who was a heavy drinker. Soon he hit a figurative brick wall. Single, he found sobriety with the assistance of a 4-month rehab program. A few weeks later, he returned. His daughter was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. He believes that there were cosmic forces at work connecting the timing of his sobriety with the diagnosis. He now has copious amounts of hope, is thankful for his coping skills, and lives with gratitude daily.
I had Steve Lillywhite on the show. I recorded an episode with him last week. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a record producer. He's worked with U2 and Dave Matthews Band, and he's won 6 Grammys, and he's a legend in the music industry. And
Good for him. Holy.
Wow.
yeah, so I got him on Zoom, and I mean, we know each other, so it was I kind of had an idea what to expect when the interview started. But I was like, "Hey, Steve, how you doing?" He was like, "I just want to say right now that Phil Collins is the greatest fucking drummer I've ever recorded," And I was like, "Oh wait, oh my god!" And I had to scramble to press, record, and he was like, "Have we started yet?" And I'm like, "Yes, just go. I'm just gonna shut up for an hour and a half, and you could just keep doing that." It was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. You have some really great guests, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. I just put episode 9 out, so I've been doing it for just over 2 months now. And yeah, it's been amazing.
I listened in on the L. Schreiner one.
Oh yeah.
That was an interesting venting session.
Yeah, we
living on the road and things like that. I really liked that one.
Yeah, and I have to say that but we both agreed that no matter how insane and sometimes demoralizing being a real road band can be, we still wouldn't trade it for a thing. It's still wonderful. So it was, that was a fun one. But yeah, I mean, just being in the business, so to speak, and being a decent person and being friendly to people, you find that you do make lasting friendships, and you know people who know people. And sometimes it's just as easy as making a quick call or a text or something and saying, hey, I know you know whoever, and I'm thinking I'd love to have them on the show. And they make they send a text, and it happens. So we always used to hear, and we used to say sometimes when we would encounter bands who were like real jerks, sometimes you're out there on the road and you meet a band that they want you to strike your entire stage so they can open for you. And it's all, and we used to say, you meet the same people on the way up that you meet on the way down. So you might want to, just be a little more professional and kind, and it might pay off later. And that was kind of a philosophy I always lived by.
Yeah, I've heard that saying several times before in many industries.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to just ask about the name of your podcast.
Okay.
When we asked you if your life was a novel, what would the title be? You gave us the title of your podcast, A Little
Hmm.
Bit Famous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a self-referential joke, ultimately. It was after my band got off the road. I initially thought quite a bit about writing an autobiography or a memoir, if you will, and I that title came into my head sort of immediately, because that really was what we were, and my so much of my life was tied up in being in that band and being on the road, um, that I think it just sort of felt right. And we were a band that was touring nationally, and we were doing at our sort of most hardcore touring, we were doing sometimes 300 shows a year.
Wow.
We would do 8-week tours from here to California and back and everywhere in between. And then we would come home for a little while and we'd go back out and do it again and again. And, by the end, not by the end, along the way, and from there on out, we developed a pretty big following across the country. We had a lot of very diehard fans who would come to shows, and we did it all by word of mouth and just continuous touring, and just kept coming back and coming back to these towns. So, we became a little bit famous, honestly. And, we got to that point where we were signing autographs and we were selling out venues and things like that. And it was nice. It was nice, really, ultimately, to feel like the work we had been doing was interesting to people and they wanted to hear our music and see us play. It wasn't really for any kind of ego stroking thing. That's just not really who I am. I part of choosing to be a drummer is choosing to be the least known member of the band in many cases, unless you're Keith Moon or something. And I'm fine with that. Um, and the focus of this memoir was probably going to be largely about my experience in the band. So that was the title that seemed to make sense. And so when I decided I might do a podcast, I really did think about it as kind of a self-referential joke, because the people I'm having on the show, for the most part, are so well known or influential in their respective passions that it was sort of a self-deprecating joke. And I haven't said that on the show yet. I'm glad you asked me about it because, I've done this podcast 9 times now, and I haven't actually at the front of the show said, oh, by the way, this is why it's called A Little Bit Famous. And I should probably do that at some point.
Well, I think I can speak as like a new podcaster. You have all these ideas, but as you go, things just evolve on their own, don't they?
Yeah.
And what didn't seem to fit before might fit. So like now and by the way, the music in your intro, I love it. Is that you?
No, that's
Oh.
yeah, again, this kind of goes back to those weird connections. But it's a guy named Jay Durius. He's from the Philippines. He's one of the most popular singer-songwriters there. And I met him through a friend in the Philippines, who works in the music industry there and has a lot of connections and friends there. And she said, "Oh, you should meet Jay, and maybe you could have him on the show." And I was like, absolutely. And we did a Zoom call just to sort of get to know each other. And it was great. And he's going to be on the show. We actually had one scheduled. I was going to record him last week. And we were set for like 10 a.m. East Coast time, which would be 10 p.m. in the Philippines. And at about 1:30, he texted me 1:30 p.m. East Coast time. He texted me and said, "Hey, I'm waiting." And I was like, "What?" So he's, your typical
Yep.
creative mind. So we had to reschedule. But anyway, my friend in the Philippines, named Michelle Lagdameo, she texted me and said, "Why don't you ask Jay to do some music for the show?" And I was like, "That's a great idea, because I don't know what to do, and I definitely want music." And so I texted him, and literally like an hour later, he sent me that music. It was
That's
amazing. I mean,
awesome.
yeah, he's this incredibly talented guy, multi-instrumentalist, kind of a musical genius. And I heard it and I was like, gold. That's it. That's the theme show music right there.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I think like yeah, like I said, it just evolves on its own, right? And like maybe now you'll include a little explanation maybe about why you named the podcast a little bit famous going forward or but the thing too is like I'm finding it very fascinating how many people want to be involved. And I like to feature like maybe newer people, unknown people, people who haven't done a lot of promotion for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I did hear a girl, a musician on the Rast drum. She
Mm-hmm.
was, I knew her because I worked with her on a public art project where we painted upcycled doors and fashioned them together as a fence.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that she was a musician until I heard her playing just a little clip on her Instagram. And I reached out to her and I asked her for samples of her music, and she turned around and gave me 3 or 4.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, this
Yeah.
is pretty awesome.
Yeah, I know. I had no idea what I was getting into. I'm sure you two have the same kind of experience, that you're going on a little bit of instinct, a fair bit of passion about the idea, and then you get the thing up and running. And yeah, I was really surprised how many people really wanted to do it and wanted to be a part of it. And Aaron Comas is a great example. He's my guest this week on my podcast. He's the drummer for the Spin Doctors, and I reached out to him. I don't know him personally, but we were sort of in the same musical circles, especially in the New York music scene in the early 90s. And he got back to me almost right away, and he was like, "Yep, I would love to do it." He was like unbelievably gracious, friendly. We had a great talk, and he's not. Sometimes you meet someone and you kind of connect and vibe on the podcast, and then that's it. They get on with their lives and you get on with your life. But we've been texting, and he promoted the show. He promoted my podcast and his appearance on the show, which is really nice, because sometimes people who appear on the show don't do that for whatever reason. They're busy. They just sort of assume that you're doing that part of it, and that's all fine. And I don't have any expectations that they will do that. But he really did, and it's been great. And I it makes me feel like very confident that what I'm doing is meaningful in some way.
Yeah, I
I
think so if people are responding in that way.
Yeah.
yeah, and I like the broad range of topics that you're covering, but especially that you're talking strictly to artists and musicians on their take on things and how they've gotten through it. It's really great way to go at it. Different than everyone else. I haven't heard anything the same, which is good.
Oh, that's like the greatest compliment I could possibly get, that it's different. And that was my goal all along. I didn't want to do an strict interview podcast. And I know that you two are both kind of into the idea of having an organic conversation and free flowing. And that's really awesome. And I mean, honestly, I love a good conversation, and I can't imagine doing it any other way. Somebody says something, if you're intently listening, your mind goes bing, and you say, oh, okay, I have a question about that. That's really interesting. I want to know more. And for me, the thing was, I didn't really want it to be it's a music or it's a creative podcast, but I really didn't want it to be where I'm asking guests, like, what's your favorite guitar pick, or things like that. I really wanted to have conversations that developed in such a way as it did with Al. You mentioned the Al Schneer podcast that I did last
Yeah,
week.
that was great how that
Yeah,
evolved.
yeah,
Like I said, it was just a big venting session. I loved it.
yeah, and we spent, I mean, Al is a member of a band called Mo, and they've been a successful band for 30 years, and we didn't even really talk about Mo music at all.
No,
And
you
that
guys
was
talked about like the
great.
early days,
Yeah.
crossing
Yeah.
paths.
Yeah, exactly. And what it's really like to be in a touring band. And
Yeah, how
but
draining it can be.
oh yeah, it can be physically grueling.
Yeah.
Well,
Um
Rhiannon and I were talking about that before, earlier today, how you're kind of shedding light on a world that we don't really know about because we're artists, not musicians. So for your listeners, you're doing the same thing,
yeah,
shedding light on what it's like to have that life. And maybe it's not as glamorous as we think it is.
It still sounds pretty awesome though.
It does.
I agree, I couldn't agree more. It's the greatest thing in the world. Um because actually it is a life of ups and downs that can be really extreme. Um there's a song by the Black Crowes called Amora, not Amorica. It's from the album Amorica. The song is called Wiser Time, and it's really, to me, kind of the ultimate road song. And if you get a chance, you should check it out. Wiser Time by the Black Crowes. There's a line in the chorus that says, and on a good day, and I know it ain't every day, we can part the sea. And on a bad day, and I know it ain't every day, glory beyond our reach. And that sort of describes a typical day-to-day life of being in a touring band. You have those nights where the place is, the venue is just packed, and
Where it's pure magic.
yes, there's this electricity in the room. And I've shared about this on the podcast that that is the kind of night where we, as members of a band on stage playing music, we absolutely give the audience every single bit of our energy, and they give it back. And it just feels absolute. There's nothing like it in the world. And then you have, the next day you show up, and um one of two things could happen on a bad night. One is the crowd is there and the place is jam packed, and you give all this energy and they just don't give it back. They just absorb it, and you just, you know, um, or there's nobody there, and that happened a lot too along the way. And you just suck it up, but those days are really hard.
Yeah, I
But you
believe
do
it.
those days, yeah, and you put up with those days, and you just keep going in pursuit of the magic nights, in pursuit of those days where you just get that feeling that just there's nothing like it in the
Like
world.
a chase.
Yeah, yeah. You could say it is a little bit like a drug. It is a little bit like this thing that this high, but it's I would say it's a pretty healthy high. It's just this, because there is this thing that's almost indescribable, where you connect with an audience in a way, where you can feel their energy, and you can see, because we were a band that did a lot of improvisation, and we would stretch out and jam a lot, and we're all on stage, and when you get to playing with a band for a long time, you develop a kind of ESP with the band, so you're not really even looking at each other anymore. You just are so tight that someone can give the slightest cue in terms of a dynamics change, or we're in a segue, and we're segueing between two songs, and someone can give this slight little cue, and we all know to transition into the feel or tempo or energy or dynamics of the next song, and the audience is just there for every second of it, and it just feels so great.
I think
um
that's definitely one of the like top things that I admire or am envious of is that ability to jam and just to mix it up
yeah,
and and feel the music. I don't play an instrument. I've always wanted to.
Mhm.
Um, but that's just not my thing. But I know Adele, you play, right? You play some instruments.
Yeah, I don't really play that much anymore, but I have a saxophone and a clarinet. I just don't play them
Oh,
anymore. But
nice.
there is that I love concerts. I'm a total concert goer, and
Mhm.
so it's funny to get that perspective of the energy because I know from standing at concerts, like that's where you go. You feel that
Yeah.
energy from the band. It's not just coming from, yeah, it comes from us to you guys, but I feel it, you feel that from the band too, that vibe, that vibe. And then that I think that attests or adds to the flow of the band too.
Mhm.
There's
I
also some
agree.
sort of like life force in there too, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
um they've done studies where they match heartbeats of audience with performers. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
I
on
mean, that
stage.
makes sense to me just anecdotally. I didn't
I
know
think it's
about the
mostly,
science, but
yeah, done with like symphony maybe the tests have been done with, and it's done on like like cortisone and saliva and things like that. But yeah,
that's
mm,
fascinating.
yeah.
That is.
Yeah, and I mean, I was very early on. I wanted to get into a band that jammed a lot and did a lot of improvisation. I was when I was in high school, I was listening to the Grateful Dead and groups like that, and then of course, um, Fish came along, and I'm not a diehard Fish fan. I like them, and I saw them many times when I was in my early college years. But something about the idea of a band that didn't have to go up there and play the same construction of a song over and over again every single night for 30 years, that was not for me. I really wanted to be in a band where we could jam and really improvise. I mean, I'm not just saying take an 8-bar solo. I'm talking about we could go up there and maybe not even say anything to each other in advance or backstage before the show. Oh, we're gonna stretch out. It just happens. And every night is different. Every set list is different. And that kept me musically um creative and unblocked for for the entire duration of
It's
being
like
in the
the
band.
opposite of pop music.
Yeah, and I believe me, I have nothing against pop music. I love pop music. I'm really am just a completely uncynical person about pop music, and I've talked about this with some of my guests. The 80s pop music scene is just awesome. I didn't love it so much when I was living through it. I was this, fish out of water during the Reagan years, and then, everything just felt wrong to me and at that point.
So who was your favorite, like what was your favorite song to come out of the 80s? Do you have one, or
Oh
do you
my
have like a,
God, I could
can
go
we go
on and on.
82 maybe? 83?
Honestly, I mean, I love music, but I'm not like a music historian, so I couldn't say this song came out in 81 or 82.
Yeah.
Um, but God, there's a million. I mean, Huey Lewis and the News were making incredible music. Madonna at the time, the Talking Heads, even the Red Hot Chili Peppers in the 80s. Um, let's see, who else? Well,
There's
I mean,
some good rock bands in the 80s too.
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting too because I wasn't, I wasn't as big of a fan as of the '80s rock as I was '80s pop. You know, not to say I didn't listen to or didn't like bands like the Scorpions and Twisted Sister and Motley Crue and stuff like that. But I mean, I certainly loved Van Halen. The David Lee Roth iteration of Van Halen, but the pop music that was being written and produced and put on radio in the 80s just had that was something I was really drawn to. I mentioned Phil Collins at the beginning of our conversation. Phil Collins was doing great stuff in the 80s. Even some of the kind of bands that came and went um were making great, Kaja Gugu, bands like that. The band that sang Always Something There to Remind Me, and
A
I
lot of
can't remember.
one-hit wonders.
Yeah, there were a lot, but darn it, they were good songs. You know what I mean? They really were. And of course, at the time, like I said, I was like, oh, this is a weird era. And it really later on, I developed a deeper appreciation for the music and the production. I mean, the production going into those songs in the 80s, people are emulating now. You know, there are a lot of bands out there now that are making records deliberately with a lot of the same, you know, say for example, an analog synth, or some big reverbs and things to emulate those sounds from the 80s, which, when I was talking to Aaron Comas the other day, we had a similar conversation about the 80s, particularly one thing that I didn't like at the time, which was the sort of very gated sound of drums and lots of reverb and, things like that. But I think it sounds great now. It's not something I would ever use, as a producer or, as a mix engineer. Those are not mix choices I would make, but I love to hear it now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've been hearing a lot of that influence lately too and noticing it.
Hmm.
I'm an 80s baby, but
Yeah.
I had um 4 older sisters.
Hmm.
So I did catch a lot, and an older 2 older brothers. So I did catch a lot of music
Yeah.
from the 80s. Yeah, that
Yeah.
stays with me. I even have some vinyl, and I have like Belinda Carlisle, like Salt and
Yeah.
Pepper, and
I'm
I don't know,
into
maybe
it.
that was 90s Salt and Pepper, but I have a lot of like old records just because of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I love it. But you know what? Another thing too, though, is I am a historian, but, um, and so when I felt it at the time viscerally, but I understand it much more now intellectually, that the 80s were like an existential decade because it was the Cold War kind of at its most heated, at least for part of the 80s when Reagan took office, and he had all this bluster, toward the Soviet Union, and he called it the evil empire. And there was this very, very significant, acceleration of the building of nuclear weapons. And when we were kids, I remember my friend Dave and I, he was my best friend as a kid. This was a sort of typical Saturday for a kid in the 80s who was at all aware of what was going on. We would just sit on the swing set and talk, and we would sing Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 by Pink Floyd. And then we would get into these deep conversations about where would you like to be when World War III starts. You know, we were 10 years
Mm.
old or 9 years old, and we would say, would you rather be right where the bomb hits and just be immediately incinerated, or would you rather be miles away and take your chances of surviving in a post-apocalyptic world? And he and I both kind of agreed, like, I think it would probably be better to just be literally standing right where the bomb hits and it's just immediately over, rather than live with radiation sickness and nuclear winter. Um, because culturally, the 80s were also a time of these unbelievably scary Cold War movies, movies like Red Dawn, and there was a TV series, a miniseries called, uh, what was it called? The Day After Tomorrow, the day after, I think it was called. You know, about a nuclear war, and it seemed likely. It didn't seem like a far away possibility. It seemed likely that we could have a nuclear war, a nuclear exchange in the 80s. So, amidst all of the Madonna and Wham and, you know, all these bands that were making this kind of really happy-go-lucky pop music, was this very serious, dark reality that we were living in, that we were, who knows how far away from a nuclear missile launch. And so it was a weird time to grow up.
Yeah, that's some pretty heavy stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
was a sensitive kid. I don't know if, you know, Jimmy from down the street was having these thoughts, but I know I was.
yeah. Well, you're creative,
Yeah.
so comes with the territory, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
You mentioned that you're a historian, and I wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit about. I know that you have a PhD in American
I do.
history. And you also taught as a professor for many years.
Yeah.
But before that, were you into music, and how did you end up um, going into American history? What prompted that?
Well, I was into music first. From the age of about 8, I started taking drum lessons, and always dreamed of the day when, I dreamed of a possible future where I would be a drummer, or I would be successful in the creative world. I also wanted to be an actor, and I wanted to be a novelist, and I wrote short stories, and was really, really passionate about that kind of stuff. But as a kid, my history was always my favorite class. And growing up, going into high school, history was really my favorite class. And I had the opportunity to go on my senior trip. I went to the UK. I was in an advanced placement history class, and we got to go to England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And I'd been to England before, but I'd never been to any of those other places. And it was just really magical to me. And obviously, the UK has so much history. When we went to Scotland, we took a train, an overnight cabin train from London to Edinburgh, and it was just magical and mystical, and fascinated me. Um, but at that point in my life, by high school, I knew that like high school was not going to be great. It was not. It was it was not a happy time for me. But I went to college for a lot of reasons. I've shared about it on the show, but for people who haven't heard me tell that story, I had a girlfriend in high school that I really loved, and I didn't want her to break up with me because I was scared about that. And so I decided to go to college in locally, I'll say, so that I could stay together with my girlfriend. And then she dumped me like 6 months later. So, I was heartbroken, but God, teen angst. But in college, I was an English major and a history minor. I was still actively playing the drums. I was in garage bands and things like that. Very few people, if anyone, really knew in my high school that I even played the drums, because I was not that kind of guy. Kid, I wasn't the walk around like with drumsticks hanging out of my jeans. I didn't wear that on my
I mean,
sleeve.
even in the 80s, you weren't doing that?
I don't know. I mean, no, I wasn't. Even though I remember there was a movie called Some Kind of Wonderful, a John Hughes movie called Some Kind of Wonderful, and I loved all of the John Hughes movies of the 80s. And the movie was about this young girl teenage, who was a drummer, and it was like all angsty, and I was like, that's so cool. And she has ripped jeans, and she carries her drumsticks around, and that was not for me. uh, but I was conflicted. I was a sensitive kid. I was a creative kid. A lot of things about life and the world just didn't sit right with me. At a young age, before I really understood it on an intellectual level, I was confused by, not so much confused, but I certainly I had a critical eye. I was a critical thinker and a deep thinker, and normal life just seemed dysfunctional to me. The idea of people just going through years and years and years of education and having their creativity just kind of stomped out of them, by being made to follow rules and think a certain way, and being conditioned to be a cog in this giant, industrial capitalist machine, um, which may sound revolutionary or radical, but I think it's true. And a lot of people just end up on that path, and they don't necessarily have a moment where they go, oh man, this is not right. Why is it that I have to go to college, or maybe not even go to college, just go work in a factory and do that for 40 years, and then maybe retire with a little bit of money to go to Florida. That just didn't feel right to me. But I didn't know what else to do, and I had been conditioned enough, and so I went to college. But all along, I wanted to get out of there and join a band, and I was fortunate enough, largely because of my decision to stay local for my girlfriend, to get introduced to a band and start. And I auditioned for them, and they I was invited to join the band, and maybe that's a whole other subject. I went off to be in a touring band, but um, I'll synthesize it very, very quickly and say we toured nationally for over 10 years. And then I toured with another band that was sort of an offshoot of my band for a year, which was amazing. I played with some great world-class musicians. And then, this sort of, a lot of people we were getting into our 30s. People in the band were married and having kids. And we kind of had that talk like, well, maybe we should take a break. And in my mind, having been through 3 years of college, I completed my junior year before I dropped out to go be in this band. I was always kind of thinking, oh, maybe I'll go back. I'm a curious guy. And I thought maybe I'll go back, and I decided to. So I went back to school, went back to the state university here, and got my finished my bachelor's and got a master's degree. And I just loved being a student. I loved learning. I loved loved the professors I was taking classes with. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to get a PhD. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I
Yeah,
just
it's
really,
tough.
yeah, you've done it too.
I'm I'm considering doing my master's, but I already know that it's I don't know,
Mm.
it's a big decision.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, it's a lonely road.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
stressful sometimes depending on the subject.
yeah. So yeah, I went, I loved the history department. I love the faculty where I was working on my master's, and I was like, I'm going to go for it. And I got into the PhD program, went through all of that, which is essentially like they just hurl books at you for 2 years. They're just boom, 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 boom. You learn the historiography, which is the history of the history. They're like, if you want to claim to know anything about anything, you need to know everything, every book that any historian has written about this subject. And so my professors would literally, I'd go in their office, we'd talk for a little while, and then I had a professor named Ann Withington. This is a good example. She was this sort of old, kind of I don't want to use the word fuddy duddy, but she was brilliant, and she just had this, kind of curly mop of hair, and she was very, very kind of liberal and free spirited. And she would just shuffle from behind her desk, and she'd go to her shelf and grab like 60 books and just shove them at me and say, "Read these." Um, and then I did the PhD exams, which was a few days of written and oral exams, and then I was in, and I needed to write a dissertation. So I loved history. I loved the process, even though it was maddening. But I eventually did write a dissertation and defended it. And next thing you know, the chair of my committee looked over at me after the defense and said, "Congratulations, doctor." And I was like, "Whoa, this is happening." And then I went off and taught college for a while.
That's awesome. Congratulations on all of that hard work and it paying off for you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I loved it. I did. I mean, I still love history. My house is just festooned with historical monographs, and a lot of fiction too. I mean, I absolutely adore fiction, and I have a lot of novels. But um, and I have to say, it was actually a smooth transition, because being a historian, and particularly being a college professor, is a performance of sorts. I mean, you're standing there in front of a group of people, a group of students, and in an ideal world, you have their attention. But it is very much like performing in a band, because you have days where you definitely don't have their attention, and you're trying to give them all this energy, and they're not giving it back. They're looking at their phones and whatever. And then you have days where you tell a great story about history, about the past, and students come up afterward and they're like, "That was amazing, that story you told about the digging of the trenches at the beginning of the First World War. I'd never heard anything like that before." And that was great. But really, I knew inside that my first love was always music. And eventually I just decided to get out of academia and get back to music.
So were there parts of academia that you had to give up in order to go back to music, and vice versa in both cases?
Yes, when I was teaching, when I was a tenured faculty member, full-time professor, I didn't do a whole lot of music. I produced some records for other bands. I would do the occasional show with my band. We're called Ominous Sea Pods, and as I mentioned, we got off the road, and this was around 2001 or two that we decided to stop touring, and that's when I went back to grad school. But we didn't we didn't want to never ever play again. We wanted to do shows, so we would get together and we would do one or two shows a year, and that was always fun. And then a friend would say, hey, do you want to come and can you fill in and do a show somewhere? And I would do that too. um so yeah, I definitely, and I was married and I had two kids, at a certain point. I had my first daughter. We had our first daughter when I was working on my dissertation, which was, kind of added to
The stress.
added to the challenge.
Yeah.
And I would go to New York City and go to the New York Historical Society when I was working on my dissertation. The subject of my dissertation was about Thomas Paine, who was this American. Well, he was an Englishman, but he moved to the colonies in 1774, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which was this massive. It was like the Harry Potter of publications in January 1776. It sold like 600,000 copies, and we were a population of like 1.2 million at the time. So it was a massive bestseller, and most historians consider it to be a significant force in convincing the Americans to push for independence. So a lot of his works were at the New York Historical Society, and I'd go and I'd spend a lot of weekends there. Which I digress. But the teaching thing, yes, I had to sacrifice music. As far as sacrificing academia for music, I made the ultimate sacrifice. I just left. I had gotten to a point where, I was burning out, honestly, and I wasn't getting the kind of fulfillment that I really hoped for, and I certainly felt like I was teaching students who just weren't engaged anymore, which is also another, intellectual conversation or philosophical conversation about, God, I'm going to sound like the old man now, but the generation of students that was coming up were just not as engaged.
Sure.
And not just, they were focused on their lives and their friends in a way that I hadn't seen before. And it certainly wasn't my experience. Of course, I had friends and went to parties in college and did all the things you do when you're in college. But, I had a genuine interest in learning. And when I was in the classroom, we didn't have cell phones or smartphones. So if you wanted to communicate with your friends, I had a student who I was madly in love with, and we would write notes to each other with hearts on them.
I just wanted to pick up on something that you said a little while ago.
Yeah.
You said that you had burned out, and that was one of the
Yes.
reasons you walked away, or one of the main
Yes.
reasons. Can you just describe maybe the symptoms of what you were experiencing during the time you were burning out?
Absolutely. And now we're going to go deep. So if you are both willing to indulge me, things are about to get pretty raw here. So there were a lot of things going on in my life during the time that I was working on my PhD and when I started teaching. Uh, so I'll start by saying I'm in recovery, and I'm a recovered alcoholic. I drank for a long time, and alcohol played a role. I was in a marriage that really was not working, and I was very unhappy, and I had two daughters. And in my heart, I knew I couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. My head and my heart, were both telling me that there was no love anymore. And it's the story of a lot of married couples, and you know, one of the things is, you know, the children, and I love my children more than anything in the world, and I died every moment I thought about the idea of not staying in the marriage, because of the kids. And I've talked with many people, I'm sure you have too, you know, people who just stay in a marriage and try to make it work because they're kids. They don't want to disrupt their lives and create any trauma. But, you know, I went to some therapy, and I eventually, after about a year, came to the decision that it would be better ultimately if the kids grew up with two relatively happy parents who no longer live together, but, you know, we're still able to be loving, you know, happy parents, to them. Uh, but and I did that sober. I've had fairly long periods of sobriety, or I had fairly long periods of sobriety in my life. But uh, when we made the decision, or I made the decision to leave the marriage, about 6 months after that, I started drinking again. So I'm teaching full time. I'm going through the process of grieving the thought of not being able to put my kids to sleep every single night. You know, we have a custody arrangement, and I see my kids, you know, often they come and stay with me about half the week, and stay with me on weekends, every other weekend, and things like that. So that was okay, but it was really tough. Um, and you know, I did what any good alcoholic does. I used a mind or mood altering substance to change the way I felt. And here I am. I live an hour and 20 minutes from the college I taught at. So I was waking up at it's 5:30 in the morning every day to drive an hour and 20 minutes each way to get to school and teach, because I chose to live in a place that was a few miles from my kids. You know, there was there was no, it was you know, no, there was no other option for me. That was what it was going to be. So I was working really hard, and I was going to school to teach, and I had met someone at the school. Another another little wrinkle, which is I met someone at the school, and we fell in love. And this was about 6 months after I had separated. And I was not looking. I had no interest in getting involved, but I just met someone, and we really loved each other a lot, and we got together. But it was particularly tough because we were both drinking a lot, and you know, I was sort of trying desperately to stay sober. And so it really wasn't a good fit. As much as I loved her, you know, she was someone who was choosing alcohol over sobriety, and I was trying to choose sobriety. And you know, it was a combustible mixture, and I just couldn't do it. So in the midst of being really an alcoholic, late stage, you know, alcoholic that I was, who was not just drinking every day, I was chemically dependent on alcohol. I had to drink. I mean, I would experience pretty serious withdrawal symptoms within about 90 minutes of my last drink. So I was very far along. And I was teaching, and I was unhappy, you know, going into a classroom and teaching students who just don't really give a crap. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, but who don't care day after day after day.
Sounds like that was a big part of it for you too. Of
Oh,
your
it was
decision was just
huge.
the reaction you're getting from the students.
It was huge. It made me sad. Because I not only am I a curious person, but I have always had on some level some commitment to service, to serving a community, or doing something in whatever small way I can to try and help people, and to try and maybe make uh, our political community and our sort of civilization a little better by maybe helping to be a part of producing a generation that's informed, um, you know, and you know, to help our republic, you know, to have a generation of informed citizens and things like that. and to pass on knowledge. And it just, I knew had hit a brick wall when it came to that. And that was the biggest thing in my mind. I knew I couldn't keep doing it. I needed to move on, and I needed to get back to something that I just really loved and also could be of service. Music is a way to help to be a part of a community where people come to see shows, and it's, it fills them ideally on the best nights. It fills them with some real joy, and music saves lives as far as I'm concerned. And so I knew that was what I wanted to do. It was a risk, but there was a perfect storm that just sort of culminated in me saying, I can't be in this relationship with this person anymore. I worked with her at the college. I was absolutely devastated and heartbroken about the relationship. I was drinking every day. It was just, that moment, this concatenation of events. And one morning I woke up and just said, I quit unceremoniously. I'm out. And it also happened to be not that long after that I got sober,
So you've had periods of sobriety. Some have been longer than others. How did you how did you do during COVID, if you don't mind me asking?
I've been sober. I just celebrated my 2-year anniversary of sobriety on July 26th. Thank you. So I was sober through it all. And that's not I had, of course, I was alone a lot. My kids are here, but when they're not here, I'm single now. I've been single for a while. So I live in this house, that I live in alone, except for when my kids are here. And I'm at this moment where I'm like, I want to share this thing, and I probably should, because I want to be on my show.
Let's say this. If you think afterwards, you can always message me and tell me, take that part out.
Yeah. And you know what? I should just do it, because at least on my show, I want to be as honest, and I am as honest as I can possibly be, because for listeners, for no other reason than for listeners. And if they hear something that helps them, then that's all worth it. So let me back up and say I got sober back in 2002, and I stayed sober for 6.5 years, but I didn't really become a member of any kind of a fellowship. I was not in recovery. I was just sober, and that's a miserable life. Anyone who's dealt with addiction and periods of being dry knows it's just brutal. You're just white knuckling it, and you can't stop thinking about whatever your drink or drug is. And so eventually, I always went back to drinking, and then I would get sober. That was my first and true love, was alcohol. I experimented with other drugs, but alcohol was like my darling. And I kept going back, and I was arrogant. I thought I could think my way out of it time and time again. I thought I could think my way out of it. I thought I understood the nature of the disease, but I really didn't. Here I am, this guy. I'm like, well, I'm kind of smart, and I should know like what this alcoholism is all about, but I really didn't. And it wasn't until that whole situation with getting out of this relationship that was really unhealthy, leaving academia, deciding after getting my ass handed to me time after time after time that I needed help, real help. I went to rehab in Pennsylvania, and I stayed there for 4 months. I went to, the inpatient was 30 days, and then I lived in a sober house for 4 months. And at that point, I had really given up. I had surrendered. I wrote they gave me a journal, as they often do at rehab, like for your moments of reflection as you sit by the koi pond, and in this nice, it was a beautiful rehab up in the Pocono Mountains.
Journaling is great. It's such a great tool.
I agree, although I don't do it. It's one of those things. I agree with you 100%.
Most people don't.
Yeah.
And most people agree.
But most people also have a really nice journal that they've bought somewhere.
That's true.
Have a great intention. There's first 3 or 4 pages are written on.
Yeah, it's this nice bespoke journal, But I was in this beautiful, it was in the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania, and it was it was a gorgeous place, and you could just sit and reflect and look up at the mountains. And but I'll just say this, and maybe some people out there who struggle with addiction or alcoholism or are in recovery will identify with this. When I went into that rehab that day, I showed up totally intoxicated, as they sometimes recommend. You just go there, you just get someone to get you. Well, the bottom line is to get there, and if and especially if you're trying to help someone, and sometime, and also because alcoholism can be a fatal withdrawal process. Sometimes they tell you, just get to a hospital, get to a doctor, be under a doctor's care when you detox, and if you have to take a couple swigs of whatever to get you in the door, do it. And so that's what I did. And then they started administering some detox drugs for me, blah blah blah. And I went through the process, and they gave me a journal, and I went up to my room, and I sat down in my room. I was absolutely hopeless and depressed, and I didn't know when I was going to see my kids again and all those things. So I opened the journal, and I took out a pen, and I wrote one sentence, which was, I have no hope, no coping skills, and no gratitude. And that was the only thing I wrote in that journal, that the entire time I was there. And that was the truest sentence I could possibly write, and so I went through this rehab, and I really, after the fog cleared, I had a great counselor, and he said, listen, you got to try something different. You got to take suggestions. And I said, okay. And what do you want me to do? And he said, well, first of all, I think you should stay. Don't leave, whatever you do. And when the 30 days are up, you should go over to the sober house, and you should stay for 90 days. And at other times in my attempts to get sober, I would have said, no. I need to get home. I have stuff to do. But in that moment, I thought, this is a moment. This is the moment. I have a professional here, and I know in my gut, I know that this is a chance to press pause on life for a minute and really focus on getting well. I was deeply unwell. I was physically dying. I was mentally ill, and this was an opportunity. And I said, okay. And I took it, and I got a great sponsor, and really just took a deep dive into the fellowship of which I am a member. And, I came home from that rehab in November of 2019, and literally the day after I got home, I got a call from my ex-wife that my youngest daughter needed an MRI. And, my heart just absolutely sank. And, we found out a few weeks after that she had cancer. And
wow.
yeah, and it was metastatic cancer, and it was it is a very, very, very rare form of cancer called epithelioid sarcoma, which they had almost no data on, no research on, no real science, and it was, it's just, I'm like, holy.
Well, that is horrible. I'm so sorry for your daughter. Like,
thank you. And
how old was she when you got that diagnosis?
She was 9.
Wow.
So young. I'm sorry. That's terrible.
I know.
How did you deal with that? How did you deal with that? Like,
I think it's the same. It's in many ways, it's this, whatever happened to me the day that my oldest daughter was born, when I was sitting in the hospital waiting room. My wife at the time had been, taken into the pre-op and all of the sort of process to get, it was my first daughter was an emergency C-section. So it started off a normal blue sky kind of day, and then bam, it was like, this is happening now, 5 weeks early. And I was absolutely terrified. Like, I was coming apart. I was like, I didn't sign up for this. I don't know if I'm going to be a dad. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah,
I was absolutely, I was like,
times a million, right?
I was absolutely like just flabbergasted by the situation. I was like, I don't know how to be a dad. I'm standing in the waiting room in this area, in this staging area, sort of in hospital scrubs with slippers on my feet and on my the cap on my head, and I'm absolutely terrified and full of anxiety. I don't know how do you know what to do? There's all these questions. Yeah, and then you know what? The nurse came in and said it's time to come into the room. I walked into the room. My ex-wife was on the table. They're doing the C-section. There's blood. I'm like, oh my god. And then 30 seconds later, they hand me a baby. And I'm like,
medicine is lovely, isn't it?
But I'll tell you what, it was, her birth and my youngest daughter's birth were the two most important moments of my life. And but that one being the first time when they handed me her and I was holding her, I felt very calm. I suddenly was like, okay, however many million years of evolution just kicked in, and I know what to do now. I just felt calm, and I was like, I'm a dad. And I think that same thing happened the day that my youngest daughter was diagnosed. Of course, I felt desperate fear and worry and anxiety about the unknown, but I was like, this is what I do. This is like, to be a father right now. So, and thank the universe that I had made the decision to go to Pennsylvania and get sober. I mean, actually, one of the things that I just wept, actually, because I thought to myself, because I'm not, everybody has their thing. I don't believe in God. I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual person. And on a deep level, I think that the awesomeness of this planet, I mean, indescribably wonderful awesomeness of this planet and the universe and everything that's sort of connected together. I'm certainly open to the possibility that there are these sort of energies and forces at play that I can't understand or explain. But I have to say that moment, I thought to myself, someone or something or some energy wanted me to be sober so that I could be there for her. And maybe that sounds incredibly self-absorbed to even think that.
I don't think so at all.
I don't think so at all either. I think, I agree. There had to have been forces there, because in order for you to even deal with the news in a calm and fatherly way, you would have had to have had your head on straight, you know?
Yeah.
So, I imagine it was even 10 times more difficult than anyone could even imagine hearing that about their child.
Yeah. But you know what? I mean, and this is the thing, and I know I certainly have come to know and have known people who've had cancer, who have had relatives who have had cancer, friends, and even children who have had cancer. You're the very first thing that you sort of immediately think of, and it's what is on your mind constantly, is the person who has cancer. Your perspective goes out the window. Your in most cases, your sense of self kind of collapses a little bit, because it becomes really about this person. And I, of course, especially in the early stages when word was getting out to people who knew us that she had cancer, we got the reaction that you two gave, which is a natural reaction, which is a feeling of compassion, and your heart goes out and you say, I'm really sorry, and this must be awful to go through. And I personally, when my reaction is always like, it's, of course it's difficult. And for me personally, as her father, as it's the worst nightmare of a parent, but at the same time, no matter how hard it is for me, it is a walk in the park compared to her personal experience with this. It's just a walk in the park. Yeah. And so I always say, I'm okay. It's, we're just kind of living day by day here, and she's going through treatment, and I love her. And you know, when I mentioned that when I that night when I was in rehab and I wrote I had no hope, no gratitude, and no coping skills, my heart is absolutely full of gratitude now. Every single day I wake up, and I don't mean to sound like, you know, a Zen Buddhist who hovers 2 inches off the floor when I meditate, but because I'm not. My life sucks sometimes, and I have lots of challenges. But I like the DMV. Remember at the beginning of the conversation, I was like, "Oh God, I could have talked 2 hours on the DMV." But no, I'm full of gratitude. Really, I don't know what's going to happen. I really, you know, the doctors don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. But see, much like what you wrote, not only do you have gratitude, you have hope and coping
Yes.
skills.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
I have all three now. Thank you for that callback, because it's true. And I think about that all the time. I think to myself that the most honest thing I said or put to paper was that sentence when I walked that first day of rehab. And, you know, thanks to the fellowship of which I am a member, and thanks to a real recovery, not dry time, you know, not just abstaining from a drink or a mind or mood altering substance, but actual recovery.
Recovery, yeah.
And recovery is a beautiful thing. I have all three of those things now, and I cherish them. You know, I never want to lose them again.
What an incredible thing to have accomplished.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just see it as I finally got out of my own head. I finally stopped sort of making stupid choices and instead listening to people, and checking in. I have a sponsor. I have a great sponsor, and believe me, I get these what I believe to be the most genius ideas ever ever contrived, and I call my sponsor, and he's like, no, 100 times no. You know, and that's a wonderful thing, you know.
What does he think of the podcast?
I haven't told him yet. I haven't said anything to him about it yet. Not that I'm hiding it from him. It's just one of those things. It just hasn't come up. But I, you know, yeah, well, I have to. In fact, I also need to tell him that he needs to give me my 2-year coin. But yeah, no, I haven't told him yet. But I know he'll be delighted about it. But yeah, and you know, kind of going back to, you asked originally about what it's like during the pandemic, being a sober person and adding into the mix, you know, having a child with cancer. It was awful at times. I got terribly, I went through a terrible bout of depression for a few months where I just couldn't even get off the couch. I was, you know, and there was one time during my 2 years here where I desperately wanted to drink as I was approaching my first year anniversary. I wanted to drink so bad. You know, it came down to whether, you know, just that kind of split second decision to call someone. And if there's something that I could possibly convey to anyone in your audience who's struggling with addiction, or who, you know, is sober and wants to use, you know, it's that call that you make that could save your life. You know, it's that call to a sponsor or a friend. And one of the things that I experienced a million times over, and I know many people who have relapsed, is you don't make that call. That's what happens. You know, you don't make that call. And the reason you don't make that call is because you know they're going to try to talk you out of it. You know, and in this, yes. Why would I make that call? I really want to drink. I don't want to call my sponsor because he's going to talk me out of it. So I'm not going to make the call.
There's
Then
so
you pick
much
up the
drinking
drink.
in COVID.
Yes. And then you're right back. You're off to the races. And who knows what's going to happen after that once you take that first drink or you use again, you know. So make that freaking call. America.
Oh, we're in Canada.
And Canada.
Oh my, this is I did not know that.
Yeah, I was going to say you taught in New York, but I didn't actually ask you where you lived.
New York is my home.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, we're in I'm in Niagara Falls.
I'm in London, Ontario.
And she's in London.
I've been to both places more than a few
Nice.
times. I've been to, yeah, I mean, my band played in Canada quite a bit. We played in Toronto a lot. We played in London a couple times. And of course I've been to Toronto and Montreal and places like that as a just a curious traveling kind of fellow. I love it up there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Um, do you find like when you were drinking and you were in the band,
Mm-hmm.
did you find like there was a lot of drug and alcohol use around you, and that sort of contributed to maybe the development of your habit?
Absolutely. I mean, boy, this is one of those questions. I know that genetically, according to the science, I was absolutely that switch was inside me somewhere, and it was just going to take a couple of drinks here and there to flip that switch. But I also think that, my experience was a combination of a genetic predisposition, a kind of sensitive personality, the world having sharp edges, and, all those kinds of things. And also I just drank like crazy and sort of drank myself over that very hard to see line between maybe, you know, uh, hard drinking and alcoholism. But here's the thing, when I was in college, I did just like everybody else did. It was a Friday night. We're going to happy hour with our chalked driver's licenses, our fake IDs, and we're going to get slammed on cheap pitchers of swill. Uh, but I got into a band, and I can say this, that I don't know many professions that are like this. There may be many, but being in a touring band, it's kind of like a prerequisite to drink on the job. How many jobs can you think of where, as part of your negotiation to do the work, you have a contract that you sign with someone that says, as part of our agreement to work at your location, you need to supply 2 cases of beer and a bottle of Jack Daniels.
Yeah, I used to be a bartender for weddings, and the DJs always got a few drinks in there.
Yeah. And it wasn't always just beer and whiskey or whatever was backstage. There were other drugs, and I was the kind of guy who was kind of okay with tinkering around with some of those things. I did. I was kind of a daily pot smoker I smoked it recreational in high school at parties. But when I got to college, it was every day, morning, noon, and night, Um, and then in college, that was when I first tried psychedelic drugs. So I was experimenting with mushrooms and acid, and then onto cocaine and things like that. And I did that on and off for periods of time when I was touring. But like I kind of said before, the other drugs uh just didn't do for me what alcohol did. They didn't take me to that good place that alcohol took me.
Yeah.
So, but yes, you're in a band, you're surrounded. We were in a 5-piece band. Everybody in the band drank, some like I did, some just a couple beers at a show or whatever. But you're whatever weird stuff you're doing, other people around you are doing. So it kind of reaffirms, that, okay, I'm not that bad, because, my friend over there is passed out and, in a pile of puke or whatever. And so, hey, I'm still conscious, so maybe I'm not as bad as he is, that thing happens. But yeah. And again, another thing too, I guess I should say, is that this is a consequence free life. At least it was for me. I went from being in college and just generally in life, having consequences for whatever behavior I indulged in, whether it was failing a class because I skipped class, or whether it was getting punished because I went out, I was living at home, I got grounded. This is a situation where you're in a band and you are traveling in whatever, a 15-passenger van in a trailer or an RV or a bus or whatever. And you're just going from town to town, and you show up at the venue, you crack open a beer, you do a sound check. You can I was blessed or cursed with the ability to drink an enormous amount of alcohol and still be highly functional and play a show, play drums for 2.5 or 3 hours every night, wake up the next morning, be horribly hungover, do it all over
Do it
again,
all over
day
again.
after day after day after day.
Just sweating it out up there on stage.
Yeah, like anxious, on the verge of a panic attack, hungover until I got to my next drink. Usually when we loaded in when we were ready to sound check, you go to the bar and you're like, all right, we need booze as soon as possible. So yeah, it 100%. It was a lifestyle that not only facilitated incredible amounts of drinking and drug use, but also didn't really have any consequences for that behavior aside from your hangover. So we could do it for days and days and years and years.
Wow. And then it's really difficult to get out of.
Once you cross the line, I've never known anyone who has crossed the line into alcoholic drinking who has ever been able to go back. It just doesn't happen. And there are plenty of people out there who are hard drinkers, who abuse alcohol, who binge drink or things like that.
Yeah, binge drinking is huge in the when you're in your 20s, like you had said.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't realize that they're actually an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Binge drinking alcoholic that drinks till they puke every Saturday and Friday.
Yeah.
Oh, it's only on the weekends.
Yeah.
That's the excuse
Yeah, right.
you hear, right? It's only on the weekends. I'm not an alcoholic.
Yeah. And I mean, you can be a binge drinker and not be an alcoholic, and you can be an alcohol abuser and not be an alcoholic. To be an alcoholic puts you in a unique category, and that category is essentially, if when you take a drink, you have little or no control over the amount you drink once you've started drinking, or while not drinking, you have little or no control over your obsession about drinking. When you're not drinking, you're kind of in the alcoholic neighborhood. And
you mentioned that too, the constant thinking about it.
Right. It's an obsession. It's an obsession of the mind.
Yeah.
And a physical allergy. The obsession of the mind, you just gotta, if you don't do anything about it, if you don't get help, you're gonna pick up a drink at some point. You can hold out for a while, but the obsession becomes too strong. And then the physical allergy is, once you take that drink, you're in. You cannot stop, and you're just going to keep drinking until you get help or something stops you, whatever it is.
It's interesting because drugs are so easy to see. You need to have that next hit, and you can tell the person needs the next hit when it's hard drugs. But alcohol is so different. You don't see those same things so physically prominent as you do with someone that does, hard. I'm talking hard drugs where it's
heroin,
or opioids or anything like that. But it's so interesting that alcohol doesn't have that. You don't have that same. Or I guess not that you don't have it or can't see it.
Easier to hide.
It's easier to hide those triggers than it is for someone that's on hard drugs.
Yeah. And I would say also, because alcohol is legal and, socially absolutely condoned and encouraged, and you're just bombarded with advertisements everywhere you look for alcohol, you can do things like get absolutely hammered with your friends at a bar and streak down the street naked and throw up into a potted plant outside of Starbucks, and wake up the next morning and everyone will just go, wow, you got really wild last night, that was incredible. But they don't think you're an alcoholic. No. You can have those moments. You could even get a DWI and your friends will be like, I guess you just had one too many that night. And, they don't immediately conclude you're an alcoholic, and you may not be, but it's not the same as like, you shoot heroin in the bathroom with your friends. They're not going to be like, oh, I guess you just had a little sort of one-off curiosity, like immediately they'll be very concerned, they'll be like, what's going on,
Yeah.
So it is different. And you can get by quite a bit longer as an alcoholic without really facing any questions from people or consequences.
You're right.
Very true. So was that from a personal account, that story of the planter?
Oh, streaking through the street.
Yeah.
No, I never did that. And in some ways I have regrets.
The old school
But
movie.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking of. No, that never happened. Certainly lots of other things did, but not that.
So I'm curious a little bit more about your music career.
Okay.
Um, I wanted to know if you've done any co-writing on any of these songs that you've played drums on, or if you have any co-writing like credits.
Um, I am not a songwriter. I'll just say that right out of the gate. I am a writer. Like I said, I was someone who wrote a lot of fiction, a lot of short stories, and obviously wrote a book length doctoral dissertation. So I know how to do that. But as far as songwriting, no. I mean, I could point to a few examples over the course of the career of the band in a rehearsal or in another environment where I contributed a chorus to a song, or a couple verses, that needed to be kind of filled in. But that's it. Really, I'm happy about that. It's fun, but really my thing was always playing the drums. And actually I'm quite a good singer. And I'm in a band where I'm singing a lot. I'm doing harmonies and things like that. But I didn't do that at all when I was in my band, the Ominous Sea Pods. In retrospect, well, for one, I was self-conscious I didn't think I had a good voice. And also I was like, I just want to play drums, man. I don't want to be the guy. Cause I thought it looked cheesy. I don't want to be the drummer with the microphone
That
dangling
does kind of
down.
look cheesy sometimes.
Right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean, I say, yeah. I mean,
it's
and so
not sexy.
you're speaking my language. I agree with you 100%. I just think it looks kind of stupid. I say this as a drummer, and even worse are the dudes with this sort of ear, whatever they call that microphone that goes from your ear down in front of your
Yeah.
mouth.
You know what's really
Um,
cool though is the harmonica. I'll go for a harmonica any day.
I don't I don't have the fondest memories about harmonica.
Oh no.
Well, yeah, because this is one of those little known secrets that when you're in a touring band, you're constantly accosted by people, usually in various states of inebriation, who just want to jam with you guys. And they have no bones about coming right up in your face and saying, dude, I need to sit in with you guys on the second set. I brought my harmonica, and that, the harmonica is the most common, or at least was the most common for us, instrument that people would just barge up to you and
Wow.
say, I'm jamming with you guys. Just lay down a nice blues groove and I have my harmonica and I'm going to kill it.
Sounds like something I would do.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
play? Do you play
No,
the
but I
harmonica?
totally
Oh,
do it. If I had and I'd been drinking, I totally would have.
yeah.
Hey guys, just let me in the band.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was just talking to, so I should just say real quickly, when my band Omnisy Pods got off the road, we all sort of went and did our thing and we would play once in a while. Oh, someone is doing some gardening outside, so I'm going to shut the window. But my bass player, Tom, or the bass player of our band, Tom Perosi, and I have worked together on a lot of other projects. And now we're working on, we did make a record together with a friend of ours named Lo Faber. And it's a great new album. And we're touring in support of it right now, and all summer and fall.
Is that the link you
Um,
sent me?
that is, yes. It's the album is called Claiborne Avenue,
Yeah,
and you can
that's
find
it.
it. Yeah, you can find it on Spotify or Apple Music or iTunes or whatever. It's just search Dr. Low, Doctor Low, Lo, and you can find his music in this new record, Claiborne Avenue, that I play drums on, and my companion musical cohort Tom played bass on. And we were at a gig and just a couple weekends ago, and I said to him, because we have so much shared history from being on the road in the Sea Pods, we started talking about the fans and the general sort of mutated personalities you see at some shows, and they're all awesome, but sometimes someone comes up to you and is you look at them and they look at you, and they're coming, and they're going to start a conversation, and you think to yourself, like, this person is either going to be really friendly or really menacing, and you just don't know. And you get these drunk guys who show up, and at the very beginning they're like, yeah, greatest drummer I've ever seen, and they give you a hug and they're like, I love you. And then like later they just turn on a dime. and they're like, if you don't play a drum solo, I'm gonna murder you. You know, you're like, oh God, this is terrifying. You know, and
Oh my goodness.
yeah, ultimately, I mean, I'm here, I'm still alive. So ultimately they are harmless, but they can suddenly just appear very menacing, you know? And so yeah, and that can sometimes be the case of the guy who comes up with his harmonica.
Yeah.
And you're like, no, man, sorry, we're just, we have a set to do. And you know, you never know. That could just be like, I'm gonna slash your tires if you don't let me play harmonica, you know.
Yeah, if
It's
you don't let
crazy.
them, if you don't let them in.
Yeah. But yeah, so now I do sing. I actually have a pretty good range, and I'm singing harmonies on most songs with Dr. Lowe, this new project.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Really cool. And did you say you're also a recording engineer?
I am. Yeah,
So how did a drummer become a recording engineer? And also, were you part of the collab and creation of that latest record, Claiborne Ave?
yes to both. How did a
Cool.
drummer become a recording engineer? And in a lot of ways, it's simple. I just hated the way our records sounded after they'd been mixed by other people. You know, I was never happy with them. It was, you know, it was the early to mid 90s, and you know, there was this new thing where these, you know, guys were getting these somewhat relatively cheap systems to record music and calling themselves engineers, and
Yeah.
they were relying on mixing choices and mixing techniques that were pretty outdated at that point. And yeah, especially drum sounds. Like, it's one of those things that is often overlooked as far as people who love music and listen to music, but just don't necessarily think about. Drum sounds are basically the most important thing you're going to get on an album. If you don't have professional sounding drums, you're going to have just a demo. You know, you're not going to have a great sounding record, because you know, amping guitars and things like miking guitars and things is pretty easy. You get and vocals easy.
Yeah.
But drums are more difficult.
Yeah.
They're a very resonant acoustic instrument. As soon as you start putting mics up on a drum kit, you start having potential phase problems. There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong. The drummer really needs to know how to hit the drums, you know. So I just, at a certain point, I was like, I just want to do this. And I was also very fascinated with the gear. That was the other reason. I'm a gear nerd, and we'd be in the studio and people would be mixing, and I'd be looking at this gear and watching the you know, the little needles moving, and they were hot and warm and glowing, and I was like, this is really cool. So I basically taught myself in some ways through close observation, and also through working with some people, sitting down and mixing together with people, and some intuition, you know. And I got to a point where I got pretty good at it, and I started you know, recording albums for other bands, and also producing albums for other bands, because that came to be me pretty naturally too.
Yeah.
The production side of things. And yeah, I did that a lot, and I have a pretty extensive collection of mics and gear. I have a home studio.
Nice.
So as far as the new Claiborne Avenue album goes, it was all done remotely,
Oh
because
wow, that's
it was done
impressive.
during the pandemic. Yeah. So
Yeah.
everybody, and there are a ton of great, I mean, really top-notch, world-class musicians on
Yeah, I was
Claiborne
telling
Avenue.
Adele, like, when I was listening to it, I could hear like the violins and the piano and just full of
So
everything.
you had to
Yeah.
piece that all together?
Yep. Everybody
Wow.
recording in their home or in a studio somewhere, and people compiling. So I recorded my drums, obviously, in my home studio. And you know, we had, you know, Dave Agar, who's been nominated for several Grammys, playing cello on the record. We had some world
Wow.
class mandolin players, and B3 Hammond organ B3 players, and you know, it's quite a project with a lot of top notch players. And yeah, so you know, and then I would send the multi tracks of the files to Lowe Faber, who was, you know, it was his album, he was writing it, and he at one point he was mixing the album, and he said, okay, there's, you know, one of the songs on the album is called Ship. It's sort of like a kind of fun country rock kind of song. And he was working on a mix, and he said, yeah, this mix just sounds really crowded to me, or to me for some reason. It just doesn't sound right. Can you take a crack at it? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I mixed the song Ship on the album.
Cool. Wow, I can't wait to listen.
Yeah. I hope you like it. It's actually it's a beautiful album. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I'm on it. I have to tell you, Lowe is a really masterful songwriter, and he wrote a lot of great songs. And one of them I talked about at length on the episode of my podcast that I did with Dave Egar, the cello player that I just mentioned, because he played all over that album, the Claiborne Avenue album. This song called Kenosha Baby, which is a song about Kenosha, about the violence and the sort of racial strife in Kenosha. And it's such an evocative and emotional song. It's very moving and timely. And I haven't heard a song like that in a long time. Where someone like, say, for example, a song like Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, where they wrote a song that was angry and sad and kind of heartbroken for America after the shooting at Kent State. And you just don't hear songs like that much anymore. And Lowe really beautifully wrote this song called Kenosha Baby that is timely, but also timeless, and just captures the emotion and the fear and all of these other, this wide range of emotions that he felt about what happened in Kenosha, the story of Kyle Rittenhouse and everything else that happened there. So that's my, how like you go to wherever and they have the, top picks of Susie, the barista, her top picks of of new music to listen to. Let's put Claiborne Avenue by Dr. Lowe on that list.
I'm going to take a listen to that one.
Me too.
Now I know you've had obviously some really awesome musicians on the podcast. Mm-hmm. Are there any new collaborations coming up?
The big one, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, is Steve Lillywhite will be my guest. We recorded the episode a few days ago, as I'm sure, well, maybe not, but maybe it's your experience too, that you kind of curate your podcast and, maybe you get a few episodes recorded ahead of time and then you decide, like, okay, someone needs to go here and then, et cetera. So the episode with Steve Lillywhite will probably be out in the next few weeks, maybe 3 weeks. He's a record producer, probably one of the most famous and influential record producers on the planet. He's won 6 Grammys. He's worked with the Rolling Stones, with U2, with Talking Heads, with Simple Minds, with Dave Matthews Band, with Peter Gabriel. The list just goes on and on and on. He's just like, he's lightning in a bottle as a guest on a podcast.
Better hit that record button early.
Exactly. Just immediately. And he was a blast. He is a true artist in the sense that, he just waltzes into a room, and boy, just commands attention in a way. And he's delightful. And we had a really great talk, and we got sort of beyond, because he's the kind of guy at the level that he's at and having produced all of these legendary bands, that he could tell you a story about how he was working on the U2 album, whatever it was, Boy or whatever. And they were working on the song Sunday Bloody Sunday. And he convinced the drummer to use a click track for that song. And he can tell these kinds of, and Bono and the Edge have a vacation home together and they're dear friends. He can tell those stories and it doesn't feel like he's name dropping. But then we also can get into things like, deeper level things. Like we talk about the fact that we're both in recovery, Steve's in recovery and he's open about talking about it. So, and I think in a lot of ways that is what my podcast is all about, is to have really open and honest conversations with people where we can talk about music and creativity, but then we can talk about other things like that. And Steve, so Steve's a really exciting one. Another one that's coming up soon, I have next week, actually, I have an artist, a singer, songwriter from Nashville named Ashley Sophia. She's just a beautiful person, beautiful songs. I would recommend to anyone who's curious to go to Apple Music or Spotify or whatever and check out her song, That Girl Is a Rainbow. Ashley Sophia, That Girl's Rainbow. It's just a wonderful sort of song that makes me smile. So she's going to be on the show. then I have
Oh.
another drummer coming up, Denny Fungheiser, who's a pretty legendary session drummer. Denny is the kind of drummer that I guarantee you've heard on some of the biggest hit records. You wouldn't necessarily know his name, but he played, for example, played drums on the song "We Got a Fast Car" by Tracy Chapman, big hit in the '80s. He's played for a million other bands.
Was that the 80s?
Oh yeah, and then she did one in the early '90s that was a huge hit. "Give Me One Reason to Stay Here."
Yeah, that's
and Denny played drums on that tune too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
He's toured with Heart. He's just one of those guys, and I'm a drummer, so I get to kind of geek out with him a little bit on that one. So it's very exciting. A lot of great guests coming up, and I love doing it. I'm sure you share the same sentiment. It's a passion project. It's to do a podcast and to have good conversations with people.
It's nice to connect with other creatives as well, and
Yes.
just to talk about like what was going on during COVID, to find out how resilient musicians, artists, singers, actors were during that time. So that's the part I'm finding really interesting about talking to so many different people, is to find out what they were doing during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And how they're coming out the other end. And it seems like everybody's got projects on the go. The wheels were turning, the balls are moving, everything's all good, and lots of really interesting projects coming out of the last year and a half.
And lots of pivots too. I find that there's a lot of different pivots coming from creative
Yes.
energy, creative flow.
Most of them talked about the initial feeling of disorientation, and in some cases they were like on planes on their way to start a tour, and they get a call and it's like, nope, it's over, go home. The world is shutting down right now, and what do you do next? What's going to happen? If you're a touring musician who like plays in front of big crowds and sells tickets for a living, it's not like let's say you're working in an office and the pandemic hits and they're like, okay, we just need you to work remotely. You need your laptop. What do you do if you're a musician who tours full time and that's your livelihood, and you have children and on and on and on?
I've bought concert tickets and had the money returned twice now.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I'm just waiting.
Yeah, but I have to say, we started our tour. We had our CD release sort of event on June 18th for this album, Claiborne Avenue, and that was the day, or right around the day that Governor Cuomo lifted basically all restrictions.
Yeah, he was.
So it was kind of like great timing, because there was this unbelievable burst of just joy and enthusiasm and excitement from people who love live music to show up at shows, and certainly the same level of joy for the musicians making the music to be on stage again, and so it's been a great tour, summer tour so far. We're heading down to North Carolina in a couple weeks, and I'm really excited about that, to get down to the Outer Banks in the middle of August, put my feet in the ocean and do a couple nights of music down there. So
Sounds perfect.
it's great. I love it. I don't know. Do you show any video content of the podcast? Oh, that's too bad, because for a few minutes there, I was bathed in this sort of
I saw that.
Do you want the screenshot?
No. But just for listeners, I was bathed in quite a heavenly glow as the sun was moving across my window here, and I felt very statuesque all of a sudden.
You looked it.
Actually thank you so much. I think I just got my vitamin D for the day. I'm feeling rejuvenated, and it's been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful meeting you.
Likewise.
Okay, have a great night.
All right, ciao.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Ted Marotta, you can find him on Facebook as well as Spotify at A Little Bit Famous, and I'll leave the links in the description. If you'd like to know a little bit more about my special guest co-host Adele Campbell, you can find her on her website, and she is also on Instagram and Facebook at Adele Campbell Artist. And if you would like to know a little bit more about me and some of the programming that I offer through BWMC Art Loft, or you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, please reach out to artbyrhiannonberry@gmail.com. I can also be found at bwimsyartloft.ca, and I will leave those links in the description as well. Okay, have yourselves a great day.